Catherine of Aragon is the first wife of Henry VIII. Yes, first wife and not even the last. But anyway, Catherine of Aragon was born on December 16, 1485 to two powerful Spanish monarchs, Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon. At the age of 5, Catherine was betrothed to Henry's older brother Arthur to create an alliance with Britain. Years later, when Catherine was 15 and Arthur was 16, they got married. But just a few days after their wedding, both Catherine and Arthur caught a sweating disease. Luckily for Catherine, she was able to recover, but Arthur, on the other hand, died due to the disease. Lucky, because now she was a widow with nowhere to go. But an opportunity came, and that opportunity was to marry Arthur's younger brother, Henry. Since the marriage was not consummated, he was able to marry Henry, who was said to be a very easygoing, charismatic, and handsome young man. Historians also say that in the beginning of their marriage, they were arguably a good couple. Although this marriage wouldn't last, because as time goes by, Henry got tired of Catherine, because the only goal he wanted out of this marriage is to have a male heir, and Catherine failed to give him a son, and she was only able to give him a daughter named Mary, who will later be known as Bloody Mary. Because of this, Henry was eager to get an annulment, and obsessed about a biblical verse that stated that it was a sin to marry your brother's widow. But the Pope didn't allow it, so he excommunicated the Pope and made himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and making the country Protestant. And that's when he was able to get the annulment that he wanted for so long. Catherine was very against the annulment and even made her go to a nunnery, but Catherine refused. So instead, they banished her from court and forbade Catherine and her daughter Mary to see each other. During the last days of her life, she believed that she was the only true wife of the king. Catherine of Aragon, at the age of 50 on January 7, 1536, died due to cancer. Anne Boleyn is the second wife of Henry VIII. She was known for being the wittiest, most intelligent, most confident, and most assertive wife of Henry VIII. Anne Boleyn was born in 1501 in Blickling Hall, Norfolk, England, to Thomas Boleyn, 1st Earl of Wiltshire, and Lady Elizabeth Howard. She spent her childhood at Hever Castle and lived a rather aristocratic life and received superb education. During her tween years, she was sent to the Netherlands by Archduchess Margaret, who was regent of the Netherlands. At the age of 15, her father sent her to France when he found out that Anne had affairs with his butler and chaplain. See, sending her to France really built her persona and what made Henry become infatuated with her. During her time in France, she was able to write her own manuscripts and books and met highly influential people at their time. When Anne returned to England at the age of 23, she was betrothed to her Irish cousin James Butler, 9th Earl of Ormond, but it didn't last, and instead she became a lady-in-waiting for Catherine of Aragon. During her time as lady-in-waiting, she was able to catch the eye of Henry. But before Henry noticed Anne, he actually had an affair with her older sister, Mary Boleyn, and even had two children that might be Henry's. And yet, she was set aside. Because of this, Anne wanted to be better than her older sister, so she wanted to be his queen and not just his mistress. Because Henry was so desperate to be with Anne, he made himself the supreme head of the Church of England, making the country Protestant. Through making the country Protestant, he was now able to marry the girl of his dreams on January 25, 1533 in a secret ceremony at Whitehall Palace. The major part of the downfall of their marriage is because Anne couldn't give Henry a son. In fact, She had 3 miscarriages and she only had one successful pregnancy, but it was a girl named Elizabeth, who will later be known as one of the greatest monarchs that England has ever seen, but to Henry it was a disappointment. So Henry is now yet again looking for another wife, who is more laid back and didn't meddle with his work. And so he needed to get rid of Anne. Luckily for Henry, he found the reason to get rid of Anne. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, observed one specific court musician who was quite flirtatious with Anne, and so Cromwell got a forced confession saying that they had an affair, which he reported to the king. And even though it's unlikely that Anne had an affair, this is what led to Anne Boleyn's execution. She was charged with perversion, adultery, incest, and plotting to kill the king. And so on May 19, 1536, she was beheaded. Jane Seymour is the third and possibly the favorite wife of Henry VIII because she was the only wife that exceeded his expectations. Jane Seymour was born in 1508 to Sir John Seymour and Marjorie Wentworth. She lived in a very aristocratic life. In fact, her family owned 100 manors in 19 countries and 5 castles, which is most likely because she is a descendant of Lionel of Antwerp, 1st Duke of Clarence, who is King Edward III's son, making Jane and Henry 5th cousins. Unlike Henry's past 2 wives, Jane wasn't as well educated as Anne and Catherine, but she was talented with her needlework. Jane started her time in court as lady-in-waiting for Catherine of Aragon in 1527 and to Anne Boleyn in 1533. During the last few months of Anne's life, that's when Henry became attracted in Jane, even though she wasn't really his type. But he chose her because Jane belonged to a large family with plenty of male relatives, and also because she had a more of a timid personality and gentle nature compared to Anne, who was assertive, and Catherine, who was stubborn. Just after a few days when Anne died, Henry and Jane got married at Whitehall Palace on May 30, 1536. While she was Henry's wife, she was able to have a close bond with one of Henry's daughters, Mary, and even tried to restore Mary in succession to the throne. And even though she failed, she was able to harmonize their relationship as father and daughter. Although Jane was able to harmonize his relationship with his daughter, he was getting tired of Jane because she was not yet with child. And sadly, she actually had a miscarriage on Christmas of 1536, but on January 1537 she became pregnant, and on October 12, 1537 she was able to give birth to a healthy baby boy that Henry longed for so many years. Although Jane became very ill, and 12 days later after the pregnancy she died due to natural causes. Jane was the only Tudor wife that got a proper royal funeral, and she was the only wife that Henry grieved and mourned the most. In fact, he wore black for over 6 months and didn't even marry for 3 years. And Henry even requested that when he dies, he wants to be buried next to her. Anne of Cleves is the 4th and said to be the ugliest but the luckiest wife of Henry VIII. Anne of Cleves was born on September 22, 1515 in Dusseldorf, Germany to royals John III, Duke of Cleves and Maria of Jülichburg. Anne, like Jane Seymour, wasn't that well educated, but she was very much talented with her needlework, which at the time was a much more critical skill for a woman than learning Latin and learning how to read and write. 3 years after Jane Seymour's death, it was time for Henry to have a new wife, so he sent the famed royal portraitist Hans Holbein to paint the portrait of Anne so that Henry could judge if she is pretty enough to be his wife. And critics said that it was an accurate painting of how Anne looked like, so Henry agreed to marry the German princess, but mainly because he needed to make an alliance with Germany because William, Anne's brother, is a leader of the Protestants in Western Germany, so that England would be ready for potential attacks from the Holy Roman Empire and Catholic France. So Anne was sent to England right away, and she arrived on December 27, and on the 31st, she stayed at the Bishop of Rochester's palace. Unfortunately for Anne, her relationship with Henry didn't go to a great start, because when Henry wanted to surprise Anne by wearing a disguise, but she didn't realize that it was Henry, so he was publicly humiliated. And Henry wasn't even pleased by Anne's appearance. He even stated that she looks like a horse. Words from a true gentleman. Oh, and he even said that he has been deceived about Anne of Cleves, and she's nothing like she was reported to be. And yet they still got married on January 6th. And after their wedding, Henry kept on ranting and complaining about Anne and said that he hated her even more, and he even questioned her virginity because to Henry she was too ugly. The marriage ended up lasting for only 6 months, and they got an annulment on May. But Henry did make a generous settlement with Anne, that if she keeps quiet and agrees with the annulment, he would give her money and dowries in lands as long as she stays in England. With this offer, of course she played it smart and agreed. She ended up outliving Henry by 10 years and outlived all of the other wives. In conclusion, the ugliest wife ended up having the last laugh. Catherine Howard is the fifth and the youngest wife of Henry VIII, being only 17 at the time when she married the king. Catherine Howard was born in Lambeth to Lord Edmund Howard and Joyce Culpeper, and a cousin to Anne Boleyn. When Catherine was in her toddler years, her mother died, which left her father struggling to provide for his family of 11 children and often begged for money from relatives. He ended up sending Catherine and some of her siblings to her stepmother Agnes Howard, Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, at one of her country wards. During her time at the Dowager Duchess's home, she wasn't that disciplined because the Dowager Duchess spent more time at Hampton Court Palace, so she was influenced by the older girls in bringing men into their chambers. At the age of 13, Catherine started having piano lessons with 23-year-old Henry Manox. Manox ended up consistently molesting and grooming young Catherine. Most of the time when she was in her teen years at the Dowager Duchess's home, she was sexually taken advantage of. But when she was sent to another household of the Dowager Duchess, she was pursued by the Dowager Duchess's secretary Francis Durham. Since Catherine was said to be an attractive, lively, and endearing young lady, it's no question that she caught the eye of Henry. Henry started giving her gifts of land, jewelry, and clothing to woo her. When Henry got an annulment with Anne just 16 days later, 17-year-old Catherine and 49-year-old Henry got married. For a while they were both happy, especially Henry since he was now obese and had a leg ulcer, and now Catherine was able to make him happy. Although Catherine was just mostly a trophy wife, which led to her having affairs with Thomas Culpeper, who was one of Henry's favorite courtiers. Gossip circulated about Catherine's recent affairs before the marriage and often blackmailed her in return for their silence. Soon, there were rumors that Catherine might have an affair with Thomas Culpeper. When the gossip reached the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer immediately investigated this case, and so he interrogated Lady Rochford, who was a witness of these affairs, and found love letters from Catherine to Culpeper. When Cranmer reported this to the king, he was in denial because he really wanted her to be innocent and was devastated to learn the truth about Catherine. And she was charged with treason for committing adultery with Thomas Culpeper. When Cranmer went to arrest Catherine, she was in such a state of shock and agony, which made Cranmer pity Catherine. She was locked up in Sion Abbey, Middlesex on November 23, 1541. Henry even ordered to remove anything that she could commit suicide with. On the last day of her life, she requested the executioner's block so that she could practice how she would lay her head on it. And finally, the next morning, on February 13th of 1542, Catherine gave a speech asking for leniency for her family and asking for prayers for her soul. And in the last sentence of her speech, she said, "I die a queen, but I would rather die a wife of Culpeper." Catherine Parr is the last and surviving wife of Henry VIII. She was the eldest child of Sir Thomas Parr and Maud Green, who was a former lady-in-waiting and close friend to Catherine of Aragon, which is why she was named after her. Catherine grew up close to her mother, considering that her father died when she was just a child, and since her mother was still working at court, she was introduced to women's education through Catherine of Aragon, who encouraged this throughout her life. At the age of 17, Catherine got married to Edward Berg, but just 4 years into the marriage, he sadly died. Then at the age of 22, Catherine and John Neville Baron Latimer got married despite him being twice her age. In just 8 years into their marriage, John's health was worsening and died. Even though she was now left a wealthy widow, she didn't have a place in court. But lucky for her, she was able to form a friendship with Henry's eldest daughter Mary, and found her a place at court. During her time there, she was able to form a romantic relationship with Thomas Seymour, who was Jane Seymour's brother, and they even had plans of getting married. But unfortunately for her, she was able to unintentionally woo Henry by her wit, maturity, compassion, and her sensible nature, who was quite a contrast to Catherine Howard, who was an endearing, flirtatious young lady. When Henry proposed to Catherine, she was devastated because she had no choice but to say yes with the proposal, and her plans of getting married with Thomas were gone. As the king's wife, she was able to become a mother figure to all of the king's children and even reconciled both Mary and Elizabeth to Henry about their succession to the throne. She also made a huge impact in Elizabeth's life and upbringing. Just 4 years into Henry's marriage with Catherine, he died at the age of 55, leaving Catherine a very wealthy widow. Just shortly after the death of Henry, she and her lover Thomas Seymour went on to get married privately. But when the public heard about this news, it became a huge scandal. Despite this, Catherine was also an accomplished independent woman because she was able to publish 2 books, becoming the first woman to publish a book in England under her own name. Just a while after their marriage, she and Thomas were expecting a baby, but sadly, just a few days after the birth of their child Mary, she died due to childbirth.